Thanksgiving, Christmas, even New Year's are times when we think of family, friends, and loved ones. And my family and friends have had quite an impact on my nerddom. Younger retro gamers may not realize how much you had to depend on friends and family to become a nerd back in the old days. Sure, today nerd culture has gone mainstream, and with the internet you can find out whatever you want about whatever niche nerd genre with just a few minutes of Googling. But growing up back in the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s a bit, often the main way you found out about comic books, video games, Dungeons and Dragons, whatever, was by word of mouth. And I've been looking back at the awesome people in my life that either pushed me into geek stuff or at least fed my addiction for it. And for the holidays, I wanted to look at the unlikely way that my brother got me into football games, or more specifically, how he made me play football games, forcibly. I remember not wanting to, but he didn't take no for an answer. So I'm going to take a look back at the sports games he forced on me, and the games that followed, the games that I ended up seeking out that were sports games. Memories from the early days of gaming, the earliest handhelds, the classic Atari, the NES, the Sega Genesis, and even the first PlayStation. That little stroll down memory and video game history lane coming up next. I think it all started with the classic Mattel Football from 1977. This one is a repro of Football 2, which came out in 1978. But both of them just absolute classics in handheld video game history, even though technically they kind of predate video games, as they don't have a traditional video display screen. They're just LED games, but these things were huge, and we had them both, and a bunch of the copycats that followed. I think a lot of retro gamers overlook these a bit when looking at video game history because they don't have a traditional video display. But really, they have a critical place in gaming history. In fact, I actually thought so much of that, I did another video where I look at that in a lot more detail. But I'll just mention a couple key things in this video. The main thing is just the financial impact that they had on the market, and how they brought tech gaming into the big leagues. When the Atari was still struggling its first year, these things took off, and early on, at one point, they were making 500,000 units per week. That's just stunning. So my brother got the first one, and we ended up with the second one, like I said, and several of the other copycat games and such. And of course, he'd recruit me for some one-on-one. It's not quite as fun against the computer as it is against a head-to-head person. But of course, he'd be kicking my ass like 80 to 90% of the time. I was the youngest in the family, and he was like 7 years older, so when I was like 5 or 6, you'd have been 12 or 13 and just mopping the floor with me. But a funny thing happened. Even though I didn't like sports at that age, and even though I was kind of dragged into playing these games as an unwilling participant, I ended up liking them. Really, despite the limited technology, these games are really fun. There's just solid gameplay mechanics, and it's really fast and addictive. So I really look back fondly on the old Mattel handhelds. They weren't the first electronic handheld, but they were a massive sales success in the late 70s, and they really kind of created the handheld gaming industry, or at least put it on the map. There were definitely types of handhelds prior to that. Ironically, the LED games, the handhelds were kind of almost like the old electromechanical arcade games, but maybe I'll take a closer look at that in a future video. But this is what really led to Nintendo's Game Watch. By the time that came around, retailers were used to selling small electronic handheld games. And so, when the next generation and the next generation and so on, and every time new products come out, they're ready to eat it up. So, I think these things really actually kind of had a decent amount of a part in bringing Nintendo's Game Watch success. and eventually, of course, the Game Boy. And I have history with these games in large part because my brother made me. But it wasn't the only time he made me play sports games or football games. A while after the Mattel handhelds started coming out, our family got an Atari 2600. And if you've played the original Atari, you know, the games are obviously pretty simple and repetitive. But so unfortunately, it was kind of easy to get bored from your games. And so anytime there was a chance that your parents might buy you a new game, it was like huge. And these games were pretty expensive back then. It was like $30. I think some might have been up to, 40 or 50, which is like $100 to $200 in today's money. But sure enough, I remember my dad and brother going to the store, and I decided to stay home, I think so I could have unfettered access to the TV and play the Atari. And when they got home, I remember my brother yelling from the door when they walked in, "Hey, we got a new Atari game!" And I'm like, "Oh, what is it?" And he yells back, "Football!" And I'm like, "No!" Oh, I was so bummed to hear it was another sports game. It was just the worst thing I could have heard. I mean, we already had a bunch of sports games because a lot of the early Atari games were, there was a heavy amount of sports games in their library. We had like Video Olympics, which is just like a series of Pong games. It was awful. And here we have a chance to get a new cool game. And I believe Superman came out right around that time. I would have gone nuts if they'd come home with that. But instead, the infamous Atari Football. And sure enough, my brother was soon making me play football with him now on the Atari 2600 rather than a handheld. And again, I almost am embarrassed to admit this, but I ended up loving that game too. Especially because I know that it's looked back not necessarily fondly by a lot of retro gamers. Especially because so many superior football games came out that generation later on in the generation, and it's specifically spurred on by the Intellivision sport games and ColecoVision, etc. So not many people give much love to the original Atari Football, but I ended up actually really liking it. It's not nearly as fun as Mattel Football, the handheld. I mean, that Mattel handheld's tight controls and fast gameplay is way more fun. But Atari Football, it was actually fun. And it was a simpler time, no doubt. It was the first console football game, I believe. Not great, obviously, but really playable for the day, which not all Atari games actually even were that. Of course, my brother still mopping the floor with me, just with sprites and in color now. And sports games then actually did continue to vex me throughout the Atari era. I remember another time, same story as with the football, 1981, except this time I was at the store with him. My dad's like, "Okay, we're going to pick up an Atari game." And I knew that they were going to get something dumb. So immediately I dove into the racks and started looking for something cool. And I ended up picking out, I think it was Activision's Laser Blast game. Because I was big into space shooters, big into sci-fi games. And of course, my dad's like, "No, we should get something everyone can play." And so we went home with another Activision game, tennis. Again, I was just so bummed out. And, I was so pissed off. That's part of one of the reasons why I got sick of my Atari 2600, because my dad would never let me pick out the games usually. But in retrospect, Laser Blast was a pretty one-note, repetitive game. Just kind of like the same thing over and over. At the time, it looked so cool to me with those continuous lasers, like the Star Trek phasers. I thought it was cool, and I'd never seen that before. Anyways, once again, the family is now forcing me to play sports games. But actually, it didn't turn out bad this time either, because Activision's Tennis is actually a really good game, and was probably one of the best games, or sports games at least, at the time that it had come out. Certainly, again, as the life of the Atari 2600 went on, a lot of better sports games came out than football and tennis. But when we brought tennis home, we were actually, the family, collectively, I remember at least me, my brother, and my dad sat down to first crack it open when we got home from the store. And fired it up, and I mean, we, like I said, genuinely impressed. My brother's like, "Hey, look, you can see the ball's shadow," and we're like, "What?" And yeah, sure enough, the game actually had the tennis ball's shadow. I mean, we were kind of amazed. We'd never seen that before, and of course, a lot of ball-related games, Pong, etc., over the years, even up to that point, and I don't think I'd ever seen a shadow used, and I think it might be one of the first shadows in video games, or at least certainly home consoles. I don't know. I've never seen anyone mention that when I've seen people talk about that game in other YouTube videos, but certainly an early example, if not the first. So tennis turned out to be a really good game, innovative, tight controls, solid gameplay, and funny enough, by the end of the 80s, I kind of ended up getting into sports in general, especially pro sports. I watched a lot of pro football, a lot of NFL. And around that time, I played a ton of Tecmo Bowl. My sister ended up getting an NES, and I ended up playing a ton of Tecmo Bowl on the NES. I think I even played a little bit with my brother, but he'd long since moved out, by that time or whatever. So this is starting to get where I'm shifting to, playing sports on my own volition, I guess. And of course, if you know Tecmo Bowl, such a huge game in NES, and I would say sports and football game history. Just love that game. Had, I think, the actual player names and such. Just really good licensed game. Or maybe it didn't. I think it might actually not have, and we just tried to connect it to it. I don't know. I also played a little bit of 10-Yard Fight. Didn't really play much on the NES. It was my sister's. So I wasn't, she had full use of that. So, but I soon got a Genesis after that. So, but around that time also, I got a Game Boy, and I actually picked up a lot of the early sports titles for the Game Boy because there weren't many games out. So I ended up getting, I think, baseball and football, and I think I ended up getting like maybe Mario Tennis or just a tennis game or something. So that was, again, even on the, my favorite games were the more adventure games. I got Castlevania on Game Boy, but still, I was paying my own money for these games at this point, and seeking out sports games, I guess. So, also I should say around this time I was obsessed with one of the greatest football arcade games of all time, John Elway Team Quarterback. That game was totally awesome. Just completely innovative and unique passing control system. The physical controls for how you made passes. It was just the coolest passing mechanism I've ever seen on a video football game. And if you love football games, if you ever have a chance to see that at a retro arcade or convention or something, you definitely try to play that if you get a chance. It's one of the most unique control systems I've ever seen for a sports game, and it's something that can't really be replicated in ports to home consoles. Though there have been some that used similar things, but it just you couldn't. They don't have the same physical part. They programmed it the same way on the screen, but the unique little joystick that they use for passing in that it's like the spring-loaded joystick that you just don't have on controls for home systems. But just around the corner was the Sega Genesis, and when they announced the first price drop, I gathered up all the cash I could and bought my own Genesis, the first console that was mine, bought with my money, not the family's Atari or my sister's NES. And one of the first games I bought for it was John Madden Football, the original first console version. I think it was 89. I think there'd been one previously with the PC, but when I put that thing in, I mean, one of the most audacious opening, musical cues to a sports game I'd ever seen. Kind of rock and roll opening to the game just kind of floored me at the time. I'd never seen that before in a game, And of course, the game itself was freaking awesome. It established not just a franchise, but a dynasty. And a year later in college, me and all my friends and just acquaintances on the dorm floor just played the hell out of Madden. We at times had like a half a dozen guys in the dorm doing round robin tournaments and even organizing our own league play. Within the first couple, I think by the second, maybe even in the first Madden, I'm not sure, they introduced season-long play where you could pick a team, but I think in the first year or the first 2 years or something, they didn't have it where multiple people could do that. You could only do it for one person. So if you wanted to have 6 people pick a team and play throughout a whole season, you had to just do it yourself. So we had to make up our own schedules, and we'd keep stats, and so we'd have season-long stats and see who, did best for rushing and passing and stuff. I mean, Madden is one of the most important things that's ever happened to football games, I'd have to say. And I ended up buying most of the Madden games of the 90s, going at least into the PlayStation 1 era. So, I guess by this time I had officially come full circle. Now I was the one buying sports games for myself. And I guess I can say to my brother John, hey, that sports game brainwashing when I was a kid, yeah, it actually worked. And I ended up getting into a lot of sports games in the 90s on the Genesis. I bought a bunch of the earliest titles, which, weren't the best of the titles, the launch sports games. But I had Lakers v. Celtics, Tommy Lasorda baseball, which definitely wasn't as strong as the ones that came after it. But it was a launch title, and since I was buying it right when I bought it after the first price drop, all the launch titles were pretty cheap, and I was definitely on a budget. So I had to go with the inferior sports games. But during college, in addition to Madden, played a lot of PGA Tour. I think especially 2 and 3. Love that game. I mean, and that was funny because I'm like, golf is kind of fun if you do it in person. But at the time, it was the first time I really got hyped up for golf video games. We also did league play in NHL hockey, and I think started to in NBA Live, I think it was. So I look back at the college days playing sports games, and that was definitely a blast. After college is kind of when I started falling out of sports games, really sports in general, but specifically with sports games, one thing that I found was interesting was all my buddies that I would play with after college, we all moved apart, and online gaming wasn't really a thing yet. So I didn't really get online until the Xbox came out. So this would have been, still PlayStation 1 era, end of the PlayStation 1, I guess. So it just kind of made me think how perfect college is for sports games, especially at least in that pre-online era, because, you just throw a ton of dudes into a dorm room. They're all packed close together, so they can all just walk over to each other's, you're just all centralized there. Everybody wants to play video games. And so, like I said, now with online play, anyone can play, human versus human. But back in those early days, college, I think, was actually like a key part of sports gaming, because it was like, it was the best time of sports gaming I ever had. So I don't play sports games as much these days, but I still have some love for the genre, especially those memories. And often when I'm, out looking for, pickups and bargains to throw onto the wall of retro, I'll pick up some sports games if I see them for a good price. Got a few 6th generation titles in the wall of retro there. Some Madden, some PGA Tour, a few others, I think. Just last week, I actually was out at a thrift shop and picked up a handful of games, and sure enough, 3 of them were sports games. PES Pro Evolution Soccer 2010. I'm like, I don't really have much soccer games. Also, 2010, it's crazy that they made games for the PlayStation that late, even though I know that the last Pro Evolution sports game or soccer game that they made for the PS2 was 2013. I think it came out in 2012 or something, but it was PES 13. And, and another FIFA 7 here. Haven't tried it out yet, but at least I know no microtransactions. And Link's 2004. I saw this for, I think, under $5, and just reminded me of the old PGA Tour days back in college. Even though I don't play these games much these days, it's been cool to at least have a well-rounded gaming experience. I always like to try to dip my toe into every genre that I can find. I remember my old film college professor would say that if you're going to be a well-rounded, knowledgeable person on film history or film critic, you've got to, be open to every genre. And I think he was just preparing some of the students for the fact that we were going to have musicals in the class, because that's not always the most popular genre with college bros, I guess. But anyways, the experience I have had with sports games allowed me to kind of like pop in here and there and see some of the progression to go from, the LED handheld and Atari Football up through generation after generation, through arcade improvements over the years, to see them turn into the games that we know and love today. So, hey, if you made it this far, go ahead and tell me in the comments below if you have some favorite game memories of the past, or specifically regarding sports games, or maybe just like the premise of the video, a person who was a huge influence on you becoming a gamer, or one of your other nerd fandoms. I just wanted to, I realized I was looking back and realized I played, actually, even though I don't last like probably 5 or 10 years, I haven't played much sports games, so not knowledgeable in that, but in the first, 20, 30 years, I actually played a lot of the coolest or benchmark games that came out. And so, I look back and I think, okay, it's all thanks to my brother John, I guess, for forcing me to play Atari Football and LED handheld Mattel Football. Thanks so much for watching. Please consider giving a like and subscribing, and we'll see you here next time on Hero Journalism.